Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves physical changes that go on near the end of life and what we used to call old age until they changed that to elderly, but now they don't like that either, so now it's called late adulthood. And there are a number of changes that go on. Most of them are based on the fact that as we age, our body begins to deteriorate. It's not something that you can stop. Okay? Now, these changes, this deterioration, is known as senescence. For the most part, they are gradual. It isn't like you wake up one morning when you turn 50 and all of a sudden you're falling apart. Trust me, you are gradually and slowly falling apart long before then. And these things are indeed inevitable. Now, some people may age faster than others. This could be due to lots of things. It could be due to genetic factors, for instance. It could be due to biological factors. But an awful lot of it is due to stuff that we do to ourselves. There's a process known as secondary aging. And essentially, if you don't treat yourself well, if you don't get enough sleep, and you don't eat properly, and you do use drugs and alcohol to excess, and if you don't get enough sleep, I may have said that before, but I probably haven't gotten enough sleep, you could definitely wind up aging faster. Sleep! Seriously, there is evidence that people who do not get enough sleep on a regular basis age faster. Luckily, that's reversible. Start getting enough sleep. And a lot of this secondary aging is indeed reversible, but it's best to simply not start down that path to begin with. As Indiana Jones once said, it's not the years, it's the mileage. Think of secondary aging as the mileage. If you're running your body down a long, hard, dark road, then it's going to age faster than somebody who's been nicer to themselves, as it were. Now, probably the best known physiological change that occurs as people age happens particularly to women. It's technically called the female climacteric, but we tend to call it menopause. Now, at the female climacteric, women stop menstruating and they are no longer fertile. They're no longer ovulating. They can no longer bear children. At what age this happens depends somewhat on genetics. When a woman stops menstruating is often when her mother did, give or take a few years. But it can also be due to factors that we ourselves have control over. There's some evidence that women who smoke cigarettes, for instance, which causes secondary aging. People who smoke or use tobacco age faster than people who don't. There's some evidence that women who smoke cigarettes go through menopause at a somewhat younger age than women who do not. Do not, by the way, use this to induce menopause. It's not recommended. But for women, it's usually begins somewhere around the early 40s and continues on through somewhere around the early to mid 50s. Now, this, rather like the empty nest syndrome, used to be thought of as the kiss of death. You hit menopause, you were old, you were done, you might as well just hang up, shop. You're done. Nowadays, a lot of women rather look forward to menopause. They no longer have to worry about pregnancy. They no longer have to worry, perhaps, about birth control, assuming that they don't have to worry about STDs. They don't have to worry about the mess and inconvenience of having a period. So, yeah, it's no longer considered to be the kiss of death the way that it was before. And a lot of women, in fact, live lives almost as long after they stop menstruating as they did before that time. What isn't perhaps as well known is that males go through something somewhat similar. It's called the male climacteric, which technically is called andropause, although it's occasionally jokingly called male menopause. But what happens here is, over a man's lifetime, he experiences, from about the late teens, early 20s on, a gradual decrease in the amount of testosterone in his body. Now, this decrease is gradual enough that men, for the most part, don't notice it. Again, it's not like flipping a switch. But males have their most testosterone in their late teens, early 20s, and it's generally all downhill from there. Now, controlled by the amount of testosterone in the body is, among other things, the sex drive. This is true, by the way, for both sexes. A woman's sex drive is also controlled with testosterone. And some women with a lower sex drive have actually been prescribed testosterone. But you have to be very careful because too much testosterone is bad, particularly for women. It can cause them to become masculinized. to show masculine features, to voice to get very much deeper, and to grow hair in places where it shouldn't be growing, and shrink breasts. I mean, there's a lot of bad things that can happen with too much testosterone in a woman, as well as too much in a man. Testosterone is a steroid. You want to be careful with this stuff. Testosterone also in men helps determine the sperm count. The more testosterone, the more sperm in each ejaculate. And indeed, sperm counts have been declining in general, not only over a man's lifetime, but also since the 1950s. We've seen a rather precipitous decline in sperm count. We still have plenty enough sperm to get people pregnant, but it is kind of interesting as to perhaps why that might be going on, which is probably a subject for another lecture. But at any rate, the testosterone level begins to reach. By the way, this has nothing to do really with what is known as erectile dysfunction. When a man is unable to get an erection, it usually has very little to nothing to do with the amount of testosterone. Human beings are one of the very few mammal species in which the erection of the penis is controlled entirely by vascular blood flow. Essentially, what happens when a penis becomes erect is that the penis it fills with blood, essentially. It gets blown up like a water balloon. Isn't that an image? But it gets blown up with blood. And so what tends to happen then if something begins to affect a male's circulatory system is it often evidences itself as problems with an erection. So that erectile dysfunction is more often due, for instance, to the fact that a man has been smoking and therefore has damaged his circulatory system, or he has high cholesterol or high blood pressure, and pretty much anything that can affect the circulatory system can affect the ability of a man to have an erection. And in fact, Viagra and the other drugs that work on this erectile dysfunction, they simply increase blood flow to the penis in order to allow for that sort of erection. Has nothing to do with testosterone. Now, if the man doesn't have a sex drive and doesn't have erections, then yeah, testosterone will help with the sex drive, but not the erection part. Now, the thing about male aging, assuming that the male can still have an erection and can still ejaculate, is, unlike women, males can father children pretty much all the way up to the grave, and possibly a day or so afterwards. There have been cases where men have died and sperm has been collected from their bodies, still living sperm, been collected from their recently deceased bodies and used to inseminate and impregnate women. And isn't that a legal kettle of fish? But, do we get survivor benefits when the child wasn't even conceived when the man died, that sort of thing. But males have been known to father children all the way up. Males in their 90s have fathered children. They simply need to find a fertile woman to have sex with them. And all the fertile women now, a lot of them are probably kind of going, yeah, sorry about that. But it is indeed true. Females have an expiration date in terms of fertility, and males do not. And by the way, we're not entirely sure why female humans have this expiration date, because it's very difficult to find any other mammals that do. Possibly orcas, possibly chimpanzees, but there's some problems in trying to tell that. So there's all sorts of discussions as to why. The most recent one that makes sense to me is that because our infants and babies have such long childhoods, 10, 12, 14 years before you can expect this child to be able to fend for itself, that if a woman continues to get pregnant all the way to the end of her life, there's a very good chance that when she dies, she will leave behind some very small children. And it might be better to have fewer children, but make sure that they all survive to adulthood, than have a whole bunch of them and hope for the best. Males biologically don't have that problem, because in terms of just simply fathering children, males don't have to put in a whole lot of biological effort. Now, sociological and cultural effort to help raise the things, yes, but biologically, it doesn't take a whole lot. This is not to say that males, therefore, can wham bam, thank you ma'am, everywhere and have kids and not worry about them. No, that's another lecture. Now, for both sexes, as aging occurs, 60s, 70s, 80s, most of the senses begin to deteriorate. A lot of times taste and smell aren't working very much, which may be why older people tend to use a lot more spices on their food than younger people do. Otherwise, it doesn't taste like anything. Vision begins to deteriorate. We have the presbyopia, the age-related farsightedness. There may be cataracts. There may be retinal degeneration. Hearing begins to go. Those hair cells are breaking down, and so the higher frequencies are being lost. And oftentimes, by the time you hit your 50s or 60s, you're beginning to lose the frequencies that we communicate through day to day. It becomes a real problem. Speed of thought and reaction time both begin to decline. And this becomes a big deal when municipalities begin to discuss whether or not elderly people should be allowed to drive. Because driving automobiles requires fast speed of thought and fast reaction time, and there have been far too many cases lately where someone in their 80s, in their 90s, has been driving and mistaken the gas for the brake and plowed into people and killed people. And this is when a lot of places begin to state, well, we're going to start mandatory testing for people above a certain age in order to determine whether or not they should be allowed to keep their driver's license. I know, for instance, in Alberta, Canada, that people are tested at age 75 to make sure that they should be allowed to keep their license. And then if they pass that, they are tested at 80, and then every 3 years or 5 years afterwards, if people don't pass the test on the first try, but they pass it on the second, they get tested every year. And you can indeed get your driver's license taken away from you. This makes a lot of older people unhappy, because in many, many places, public transportation is not good enough to allow these people to get from home to doctor, to store, to family, for instance, without a car. So they don't have a car, they're stuck at home. They can't get to the places they need to get unless they can hitch a ride from someone. So you wind up with the elderly basically, saying, "You can have my car keys when you pry them from my cold, dead hands." And you tend to then have younger people going, "Yep, keep driving and that day will come sooner than you think." And needless to say, that's not a very pleasant conversation. I suspect for most people you would just want to be able to monitor it yourself. Once you realize that something is becoming difficult, you need to admit to yourself that it is, and perhaps rearrange things so that, for instance, if driving at night has become difficult because of age-related problems, then perhaps do your best to not drive at night, that sort of thing. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that at any age, major memory loss is not normal. Minor memory loss is perfectly normal. Forgetting where you put your keys, forgetting somebody's name that you just met, or those things are perfectly fine. And in fact, people do find that they lose more and more of their ability to remember those sorts of things as they age. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are things like forgetting what a key is, not knowing what it's used for. Forgetting your grandchildren's names are one thing. Forgetting you have grandchildren is quite another. So we're talking huge major memory loss gaps. That is not normal. Now, when you start talking about this sort of major memory loss in the elderly, you start talking about Alzheimer's disease. And yes, Alzheimer's disease does indeed take away memory, but not everybody who's old gets it. Although the older you are, the more likely you are to show signs of it. But there's lots of other things that could also be causing memory problems. One major thing in a lot of the elderly that could be causing these problems with memories is the amount of medications that they're taking. Very often, older people are taking 6 or 8 or 10 medications, basically, for everything under the sun. And these medications can add up, or they can interact with one another and basically prove to be a real problem. There's a lot of elderly people that were certain they had Alzheimer's until they got their medications adjusted. And then they, quote-unquote, came back. Or it might be due to microstrokes that people are having, and maybe a medication to help the blood coagulation, to help prevent these strokes, might help. But if you ever see somebody who's showing signs of major memory loss, you want to get them to the doctor, because it's not inevitable, and there may indeed be something that can be done, if not to stop the memory loss, at least perhaps to slow it down a while.